So you thought 3 years ago, I guess, that doing a panel on mistrust was prescient, and clearly all the mistrust has dissipated, as Michael has just said, into trust, but misinformation has not dissipated into information. So we're going to have a conversation about to what degree is misinformation as disseminated through all the different ways in which it is, from people talking to one another to people Twittering, LinkedIning, platforming, teletalking, you name it, to each other. But one thing I want to do as we go about this, and kind of in the spirit of never assuming what we assume, to just probe whether or not what we perceive to be a concern should be a concern to the degree it is. And I do that in the spirit of, we should all be constantly in the process of investigating our own beliefs and assumptions about what's going on in the world, no matter what they are, as a continual process to make sure that we don't get stuck in our own ruts of belief, because I think those ruts of belief and the scrim and the view of the world is part of what leads to a kind of chronic climate of misinformation and disinformation. It's when you stop questioning your own views and your own assumptions and become certain in your certainty that that climate can foster. And I think we are all susceptible to that, right? That's not just a function of what others whose views we believe to be either inimical or destructive or wrong. It's something we can all do ourselves. So if I push and I probe and I question, it's in that spirit, not in an agenda per se or a viewpoint per se, although of course I have my own viewpoint. I did a quick Google scroll. Google's this amazing thing. You guys should check it out. There's a lot of information there. And you type in misinformation, and it's just a litany, hundreds of pages of why misinformation is a threat to democracy, a threat to progress, a threat to global order, a threat to collective trust. And then there was a whole series of academic papers drawing the distinction between misinformation and disinformation, right? Misinformation is the propagation of information that is wrong, but not necessarily knowingly or willfully. Disinformation is the purposeful propagation of information you know to be false for a purpose, political, social, personal, or otherwise, which I actually think is a legitimate distinction. It's the difference between libel as things that you publish that aren't true, but which you didn't know to be true, versus malicious libel, which is the purposeful publishing of information you know to be false. So we have three people from very different backgrounds, some from nonprofits, some from academia, some now from academia and consulting. So we all come at this, I think, from different angles. And to start it off, I'd like each of you to first say a little about where you come into this from, and also identify what is the issue here. What is the threat of misinformation? Is this a new thing? If you do that Google scroll, there's a lot about this is a dramatically new problem of our present, fueled by social media, fueled by the technologies of information conveyance on steroids. Much of that, I think, misses some of the history of human beings misleading each other. Those of you who are American and studied the rise of yellow journalism in the 1890s and remember the Maine, the thing that began the Spanish-American War, which of course was completely false. So, what's the threat? And what is it about the present that is more particular, or is there nothing particular about the present? This has always been an issue, but we're now really attuned to that. And Mintu, why don't you start from, you've been in global politics, the UN, and are now more focused on democracy promotion, and also have an interesting sort of personal background in trying to talk about democracy and communities.
Great, thanks so much, Zachary. It's really great to be here. Good morning, everyone. So I come at this from that perspective. So I had worked in other countries, seeing democracies fall apart, trying to bring countries and societies back together again after war. Then I saw some of the signs of a failing democracy in the US. And so I took a pivot from working on global politics and bringing countries together to then looking at how we resolve those issues here in the United States. And in part, just to Michael Green's comments earlier, it was because we saw elements of a rise of authoritarianism in this country. My family came to the US as refugees from Vietnam. We were fleeing authoritarianism. And so then to see some of that here or there in the US, on the other side of the border, it was really concerning to me. And so in 2020, I ran a super PAC, which is a political action committee, to try to help do what I could to defeat Donald Trump. Now, I don't want to get super partisan on this, but I do think that he was a threat to key elements of our democracy, and that's not a Republican or a Democratic issue. It is a pro-democracy issue, and who we think of, what we think of as a democracy. And in that, the work that I did was to help reach out to Asian American and immigrant voters in swing states in the United States. There are particular states that have more of an influence in the outcome of a presidential election than others. And in those swing states, the fastest growing electorate were Asian American and immigrant voters. It's the fastest growing part of the electorate. And a lot of those voters do not get their information in English. They don't go to CNN or the New York Times or the Washington Post. They get their news from YouTube and Facebook and WeChat and WhatsApp. In that process, I noticed that the information they were getting was incorrect, was problematic content. And so where I come at this is the harm that's being done to these communities in undermining their trust in our democracy. And we saw some of that play out just before and around the January 6th insurrection in the United States, where about 80% of the funding that the Proud Boys got before January 6th was actually from Chinese Americans, the Chinese diaspora, because they believed that there were, that radical communists, socialists were taking over the United States and that the Proud Boys were defending American democracy from radical socialism. And so, you know, when you see this nefarious content, and I do think it was disinformation, there are anti-democratic forces that are targeting vulnerable communities where they get their information and undermining their faith in our democracy. And so just to your point, Zachary, I do think this is, disinformation propaganda is not new. You know, when the printing press came out, as you mentioned, you know, we had there were dramatic societal divisions and polarization as well. I do think what's different is the efficiency of these dissemination platforms. So WeChat, the sort of messaging apps, social media, you know, really can target specific populations and meet them where they are. And the amount of time that people spend on these platforms and where they get their information is just really problematic. So that's how I come at it.
All right, so we'll circle back to the is it true question. Kourosh, you've been in journalism. You're now a consultant. You have a very good career. You spent a year in China. Where do you enter into? And you were part of the REACH program, which.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this really rich conversation. So I come here, I think, with two hats. One is I'm a behavioral data scientist, and so a lot of my framing is around how does misinformation fit in the context of narratives. I think there's a second hat, and probably more important, is I'm part of the REACH Alliance, which is an incredible alliance of undergraduate, graduate students at the University of Toronto, where we look at case studies in different areas of the world around real examples of where innovations on reaching the hardest to reach actually matters. And in those contexts, you see how trust is such a critical and fragile thing, and in fact is often the big unlock. So one of my favorite quotes is a David Hume quote, and it's, reason is the slave of the passions. I think I look at the process by which close family members of mine consume information. And actually the COVID world was a really interesting case study for me of seeing people listening. My mom, looking at graphs and charts, a sight I could never imagine myself. You know, she was telling me about the R squared of, I was like, but it was a moment of real, it was a really compelling moment of needing to know the truth. You needed to know the truth because it actually meant something very specific, and you spent a lot of time on it. Over the course of COVID, I saw the process by which my mom, my family members understood how to consume information, went through a transformation. And actually that transformation would not have happened if there was not a necessity for it. So I think for me, the big thing is we are in a moment, what's unique about this moment is that there is hypersensitivity around trust. You then also place non-intentional misinformation in that narrative. You place non-intentional misinformation in the narrative of, I trust this or I don't trust this, and it also creates, it kind of propagates the problem, so.
Mintu, you talked about having this issue with sort of, does one argue with family members about different sources of news, right? And I mean, why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because there is that challenge also of person X is reading their source, and person Y is reading their source, and then they also happen to be family members, and you're arguing about sources that say completely dichotomous things.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have family members, you know, when you look at the 2020 election in the United States, who deeply believe that there was dramatic, significant fraud in the 2020 election. And after all of the analyses and despite what we know factually about the 2020 election, that there was no significant fraud, the narrative that, for instance, the Chinese Communist Party bought out Dominican voting machines and then were able to control the outcome of so many elections.
Dominion voting machines.
Dominion.
But they may also have been Dominican, according to...
Dominion. This is reference to another conversation. Dominion voting machines. You know, but this is, you know, there is I think for a lot of communities that are, especially on the margins of society, where they feel like there are forces that are controlling society and controlling their lives that they don't understand, there's a susceptibility to conspiracy theories. And so it doesn't matter the kind of facts that you put out there. If they feel like there are forces against them that are undermining what they perceive as a shift in values in the country that they really love, you know, it's very difficult to bring them back. I've had very difficult conversations with family members, and they say, you cannot trust CNN. They talk about CNN like we talk about, you know, OAN or Fox News or Alex Jones, because they don't believe, they say, you know, anybody can shift news or post an article, and they just don't trust it. Who do they trust, though? They trust commentators who they've listened to for years. They trust family members. They trust people in their community. And if they keep hearing the same thing over and over again from people that they trust, they're going to believe that more than the New York Times article that I forward along.
That's a good segue into Justin's project. I mean, Justin, you're the most academic amongst us in that you have a posting at a university, but you've also created this nonprofit media project that you've been focusing a lot on January 6th and how information is disseminated about what went on then, and also trying to really figure out what went on then. So where do you come into all this?
So I would situate our question around misinformation, disinformation, in a kind of broader question around global collective behavior. And if you think about what you all are up here to here, you're thinking about social progress, you're thinking about how to solve together big problems, and we increasingly face big and global problems that are highly complex and require us to network and to solve problems in ways that we never have before. When you bring to the table also this issue that digital communications, not just social media, but digital communications more broadly, have changed the way that the species interacts at a species level. And I don't want to sort of diminish that, you know, even as we might feel the need to diminish maybe slightly our concern around disinformation, what we've learned over the last few years. I would point you to a paper by a friend of mine, Joe Bach-Coleman, who, with about 22 other authors from a variety of different disciplines, asked this question about global collective behavior. And do we have the science to understand really how digital connectivity, the pace of our communications, the pace of our interactions have changed the way our politics work, that changed the way that nations interact, changed the way that families interact, that friendships are formed, that the type of motivated reasoning that you're describing, what are the inputs into that, and how does that happen? So I think of this as an evolving question, a science, really. And over the last 5 years, really since 2016, a big wake-up call, where the Russian interference in the 2016 election changed some funding priorities for a lot of organizations, foundations, governments, and an enormous amount of science has been done to look at this problem. So we're learning a lot about the role of misinformation, a role of disinformation, and for the first time, a lot of that is very legible to us because of digital media, because of the fact that we can see it. January 6th is an excellent example. Huge amount of communications stored and collected into databases that people are continuing to publish on. I just came back from the International Communications Association conference in Paris, which is a huge conference of communications, journalism scholars. And there were dozens of papers related to January 6th, related to the behavior of individuals, related to data sets from places like Parler, Facebook, Twitter, Discord, et cetera. And we're beginning to see the connections between the movements of masses of people, their political rhetoric, their behavior, connection to political elites, connection to traditional media, and how that can incite certain behaviors, and how those things fit together. So to me, we've got perhaps a bit more clarity on what the real problem is, and yet it's an enormous and daunting task to think about what to do next.
You know, it reminds me, so I was trained as an historian, and I have a tendency, you know, this is my own liability, to look at everything in the context of, like, is it different, right? Is it, and for generations, right, you had people talking about herd on the Rialto, or gossip spreading like wildfire amongst a crowd. Wildfire was always like in English, a major metaphor for the lightning spread of misinformation, you know, that would go from person to person to person, and suddenly it would be everywhere. And I wonder, you know, to elaborate on what you're saying, like so many things in our world today, we have gotten so much better at diagnosis and at identifying problems, analyzing problems, researching them, whether that's viral transmission of actual viruses or viral transmission of information. The question is, in a prognosis way, are we just better at identifying a human condition, right? The ability to believe a reality we want to believe, in which case a prognosis of this is dramatic and new and different is probably not right? Or are we actually saying, as many people do, that the combination of human tendencies and the particular metrics of and qualities of technology, information technologies, has not just changed speed and quantity, but something fundamental? I mean, where do you, because you just talked about the sociology of this. And then, Kourosh, I want you to, particularly given that you've looked at behavior and data, to talk about that as well.
I spent a day at the ICA conference in a pre-conference called What Comes After Disinformation Studies, the premise of which was that, you know, there's a complex onion here we've got to peel. There's a lot going on in society. You can't blame social media for the problems of society. You know, fundamentally, the rise of Donald Trump isn't the fault of misinformation or disinformation. Fundamentally, right, it's a much deeper set of issues that are present in American society, many of which have been present in American society long before the internet.
And every other society, whether it's, you know, Marcos in the Philippines,
Absolutely.
or Orban, or, I mean, this is a global...
Absolutely. And we have always, as a species, existed in a stew of bullshit, right? And so
he'll provide the recipe for that after, for those of you who want.
That's right. So it's not, you know, that's not new. But I do think that is of little solace to communities like the ones that you've referred to. I'd point to a coalition called the Disinfo Defense League, which is, I think, now over 300 organizations, mostly grassroots organizations, Black, Latino, and other minority groups in the United States, who are confronting the type of daily assaults, information warfare in their communities that are intended to do all sorts of things, from discourage them from participating in democracy to various other harms. And those phenomena are very real. And so people are, this blurring of the digital world, this blurring of our experience has real effects and can result in real violence and real outcomes that are detrimental to our democracy. So despite the fact that, yes, when we zoom back out to the moon, we could look at the human species and sort of regard it as always having, existed in fantasy and under the thumb of various authoritarian interests and political elites who want to mislead. I mean, don't forget, governments and political leaders are the #1 source of disinformation and misinformation in the world. But regardless of that, at that grassroots level, it matters.
Kourosh?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I completely agree in that disinformation, misinformation is not new. But what is new is the velocity of information transfer. And again, that's not something surprising. We all know information moves faster. But what does that really mean? We have an interesting, there's a science article around that tries to quantify what is the tipping point of information that becomes common knowledge, right? Like, what is the critical point? There is and the authors of this journal put that at around 25%. So 25%, but the interesting thing is 25% of strong ties, of communities that you consider strong ties. It's a whole different discussion. What do we mean by strong tie? That's undetermined. But the point is, we are in these chronic cycles of reaching a series of new tipping points on every new kernel of misinformation or disinformation. The other interesting thing, I think, from a behavioral science perspective, there's two train of thoughts in terms of what does it take to actually change people's behaviors or even knowledge sets. There's some group of people that think a precondition to behavior change is awareness. But then there's a different philosophy around it that awareness is not important. You are just involved in a series of repetitive behaviors that doesn't require an awareness of what is happening. You are just in the motions, and those motions eventually become your reality. So what does that mean for this conversation? I think a very odd kind of, mental conversation I have with myself sometimes is it enough for people to be aware that they are wrong? Even if they are aware that something that they are saying is incorrect, is that enough?
There's a good amount of psychology researchers would just say no, right?
No.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Exactly.
That classical reasoning kind of model versus the motivated reasoning model, very important in this conversation.
And Mintu, in the advocacy part, so the devil's advocate pushback is, politicians and politics seek traction. Raising fear and outrage is the most immediate way to get people to give money or show up to the polls. But that this is, as it were, a nonpartisan malady. I mean, I'm on the receiving end, because I give a lot of money to Democratic candidates, of endless emails that I really desperately try to unspam, and now that they're showing up on my messages on my phone and on my WhatsApp, so I'm basically just giving up. And so the Republican, again, we're being very American about this. I know we're in Canada, and Canada has its own, left-right issues. At least that's what I'm told, or maybe Canada's solved everything. So Democrats will say, Republicans will say, Nancy Pelosi wants to take your guns. That'll be like the lead email, or she wants to make your children transgender. The Democrat will be, and I get this, I'm not making this up, Republicans don't want you to read, right? And while it is certainly true in each of those statements that you could find a set of people within each of those very large tents whose positions and words pretty much approximate that statement, those statements, right, as unambiguous, unalterated, unnuanced statements, are misinformation, right? To make the statement of Republicans don't want you to read, and I've gotten this from Democrats, is equally misinforming. It may actually be disinformation as a statement. So what do you do to offset that tendency, right? Because it's not a Republican tendency to undermine democracy. That may also be happening, but those ways of disseminating information, Eli Parasar, who's part of the Progress Network, talked about filter bubbles and the way in which one can get into a much more hermetically sealed information environment, whether that's new or not. So what do you do to kind of offset that on all sides?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had the answer to that. I think we would have solved it if I did.
You have like 18 minutes.
I have 18 minutes. So
9 seconds.
We'll
Exactly.
listen. We'll listen.
All right.
We'll see the.
You know, so great question. And so just to pick up on the point that was just made about being aware, you know, a lot of the initial efforts have been around fact checking. So I'm on the board of a group that runs Viet Fact Check, which provides fact-checked content. You look at, you know, what are the sort of misinformation, disinformation narratives that are out there, and then provide reliably sourced information that combats this stuff out there. So I have sent that to numerous family members. It doesn't matter that they're aware that some of this is not true. It's the fact that, I mean, the kinds of headlines that you're talking about, they're the tiny grain of truth in that, okay, maybe Republicans don't actually not want you to read, but they are censoring things. So, you know, so there's a way to rationalize in your head why the Republican Party or the Democratic Party might try to sell a headline or a mistruth to you. And that then undermines your trust in the parties and makes a lot of people just give up. You know, why should you vote when you can't really believe in either side? And it's particularly for vulnerable communities who already, you know, don't feel like they have a role in our society and our democracy. You know, when they see these kinds of things, it just makes them want to give up and not participate. So I think, you know, so fact checking doesn't necessarily work. I don't know what the right answer is, but I do know that we have to at least try, because the anti-democratic forces out there are doing it. They are going out, reaching these communities, trying to sway them, and the pro-democracy activists and, you know, forces are not doing an adequate job. So is that going to work? I don't know, but I do think we have to at least try, because the forces against it are really organized, and, you know, they're learning from one another. I mean, you look at the authoritarians around the world, they're learning from each other's playbook to try to figure out how to undermine and sow chaos in our democracies and undermine democracy. So we have to at least try. I don't know exactly what works, but when you do reach out to people. So in the 2020 election, the efforts that me and my colleagues did, and many other organizations did, to reach out to voters in their language and meeting them where they were, on Facebook, on WeChat, et cetera, in ethnic media, we were able to turn out voters who had never voted before. So there was a 47% increase in voter turnout among the Asian American community from 2016 to 2020, an increase in 47%. And that made a key difference in places like Arizona, where Biden won by 10,000 votes, and there were 26,000 first-time Asian American voters. So it does work, at least in terms of just getting people maybe to turn out. And at some point, I think that shift in politics, because, you know, I'm sure you're going to talk about social media regulation, but that shift in politics and just getting the right folks in power to then try to do something about it, whether doing something about it is just merely, I'm not going to try to sow disinformation in my campaign messages, you know, is I think enough, or hopefully we can get to a tipping point with the right kinds of leaders where then we can create a bigger shift.
Yeah, so into that kind of social media question. And by the way, I mean, I know we're using the United States right now, I guess, given the panel as an example, but you could tell the same stories, obviously, about Bolsonaro versus Lula in Brazil. You could tell the same story about the BJP and Modi and state elections in India. You could tell the same story about AMLO and elections coming up in Mexico, about, go down the list, about Orban, about Brexit and Tory parties in Britain. So
yeah, well, and even to this point, you know, a lot of the disinformation is coming not just from the Russians, but from other countries. So in the 2020 election, a lot of disinformation about, for instance, Vice Presidential candidate Kamala Harris was coming from India, saying that she was insufficiently anti-Muslim. And so Indian Americans shouldn't vote for her.
Well, I think she is probably insufficiently
She's probably insufficiently, according, to Hindu nationalists. But so this is, it's being, you know, the messages are transnational. Latin American Latinos were getting disinformation from their family members and priests in Latin America saying that Biden is a baby killer. You know, don't vote for him. He's a socialist like Maduro in Venezuela. So, you know, this isn't just limited to our borders. The disinformation travels.
So the question, I want to pick up something, Kourosh, you talked about of, because the flip side of all this is that people are in a weird way also simultaneously can be and often are more informed about things. You know, your parents suddenly knowing what R squared is and understanding viral transmission because they went online and tried to figure out what the hell is going on with COVID. And the issue is, if one were to try to, as many legislative bodies around the world are trying to create more guardrails around online information, can you do it in a way, is there a way of in any way moderating or legislating or regulating any of this without the proverbial baby and bathwater question, right? Without limiting the information and the ability of someone to basically go online and learn stuff, figure things out, go on to a community on Reddit or like interact with knowledge. Is there any way to limit the egregiousness without in any way constraining the bountiful, the ability of information to enliven and lift us all up?
Yeah, I don't know.
Come on, I mean, these are like easy questions. I'm expecting, the audience wants immediate, simple button.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, well, here's the answer. No, honestly, who knows, right? Like, that's the issue. I think, I don't know, I go back to, there's probably a level of altruism that has to exist. And I know it feels a little bit unsatisfactory, but I think there's, it's a tough balance, right? You want to know what people do, look at their incentives, right? Like, you want to know what decisions governments make, look at their terms. If you want to make, know what, like, in the context of looking at current incentive structures, right? Let's assume current incentive structures. I think there has to be a level of altruism. If not that, I think there has to be a fundamental shift in how we incentivize businesses, governments, and whatnot. I also want to quickly just give an example of a success story, because I think it is, we can go down a road of like, misery of misinformation, and I think, there's reason to believe that that might be a path. But one of the case studies that we did in South Africa with the Reach Alliance was an incredible story. From 1991, South Africa's birth registration was at 25%, something like that. In about 10 years, it almost became universal. In communities that had no business trusting the very governments, I mean, a different government, but the machinery and institution of government, right? It was a really compelling idea of what in those scenarios happens that makes people willing to trust. What are the narratives that exist that makes that willing? And so maybe part of it is actually looking at case studies of success as well in its own ways.
Justin, and if you don't want to answer this specifically, you can do what politicians do, which is answer the question you want to answer. But I'm wondering, in the kind of the world of looking at communications tools and communications conferences, we spent a lot of time looking at all the toxic aspects of information online. Do people then look at Wikipedia and aspects of Reddit, which are clearly much more functional spaces of information sharing? I mean, Reddit's a little more complicated because you can find almost anything, but there's a vast amount of Reddit that is well-moderated, sure, information sharing content in very specific verticals and sometimes more general. And Wikipedia is rather extraordinary, right? Which is, we've basically created in, I don't know how many languages Wikipedia is in now, it's at least 24, a kind of information repository that is honorable, vetted, altruistic. I love the fact that you use the idea of altruism as part of the culture. Altruistic, and it's a lot of people just giving their time to moderate. And is there anything we can learn from that? And again, that's a specific question, but it's also a general one.
So I'll tie the two together and answer that, one thing we haven't talked about to some extent on the panel is the economic incentives that are producing a lot of this context that we're in. And I mentioned this Disinfo Defense League, this band of 200, 300 grassroots groups, mostly representing Black and Latino groups in the United States. And they put out a policy kind of platform what to do about disinformation. And you might have expected that it would have all sorts of things in it about what types of content to take down or how to gauge this hate speech versus that. But it didn't have any of that. What it focused on was two things: privacy and the economic models of the big tech platforms, right? Which themselves encourage bad behaviors in users. Their design, the design of the networks, the incentives on our social platforms, the economic incentives that the platforms respond to. Unfortunately, we now have enough evidence to say it is producing an unhealthy information ecosystem. So, that's one thing. Now, how would I kind of tie that back? Different governments are looking at that problem and thinking about different things to do with it. Your government here in Canada wants to have a online safety bill, a kind of regulatory apparatus that would do much more active takedowns and very worryingly, at least in the last iteration of it, have a kind of membrane with law enforcement, which you all should really interrogate and ask your politicians to interrogate. But looking at those economic models and thinking about that. The other one is privacy. The United States does not have any comprehensive privacy legislation. The EU is much further along on that. Some of the worst forms of disinformation, misinformation that you can imagine, they're powered by personal information, right? The ability to target people with specific messages, all that stuff that's coming across the transom on your WhatsApp and your Signal and your, the rest. Yeah. So, that's an incredibly important piece of it. And, as far as kind of, I don't know where we're going to take the policy piece of it, it's a hard place. We're in a really rocky spot on that at the moment. There are various governments around the world, the UK is one, that think they're doing the right thing, that think they're pursuing policies that will improve democracy, and yet are sending signals to other illiberal democracies or challenged democracies that unfortunately may ultimately end up in oppression. And that's a hard thing.
So we have some time for questions if anyone has. I don't know if there's mics going around. Back here. Is there a mic anywhere or?
Right. Hi, Kira from Deloitte. And to follow up on that question, we were just talking about policy and regulation. Have you, in that series, there's this new EU law, which is encouraging the sort of more transparency and openness about the very algorithms and the business models. And do you think that, because that's less moderation and more about like, tell us how you're making your money so we know if there is misinformation, it's creating these problems. Do you think that is a sort of head and step in the right direction to really look at those economic models and other things? Because I think a lot of that came out of the whistleblower stuff versus the content moderation where you can get into oppression, as you said.
So if you're referencing the Digital Services Act, and it has a provision in it for essentially required transparency, researcher access to platform data. And under GDPR, there's other mechanisms to make that possible. In the United States, there are a couple of pieces of legislation that are put forward. The Digital Services, Digital Safety Oversight, the DSOSA, I'll never get the actual acronym correctly, put forward by Lori Trahan and Adam Schiff. There's another thing in the Senate, the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, which would do something similar to this DSA measure. Essentially create a mechanism to get access to platform data so scientists, independent researchers can more narrowly define these problems and hopefully help the world come to better solutions. That, to me, is priority number one, and it should be something that people support. And I believe the online safety regulation that's proposed here in Canada that is under a new form of kind of consultation at this point, as I understand it, would do something similar. So that hopefully, when that takes place in the EU, and there's a lot to figure out about how to do that safely and with privacy kind of concerns sorted out and the rest of that, but that should take things forward.
Hi,
And then there.
Carl Nelson, artist.
Good catch.
I was surprised. I have two tracks. First, when you make small changes in rules, it can have a big impact on outcomes. The old thing about in the NBA going to the 3-point out. Okay. So the same thing with Facebook likes and shares, Twitter likes and shares. Simple rule changes like that can make a big diff, particularly to my grandmother and mother who wants to know how many likes has this had. If they turn that off or down such that after 2 shares you can't do it no more, then they can look at it and go, oh, it's only got, whatever. So that would be, can we look at making small changes to make big impact? But the one that's really motivating to me is, can we put guardrails up around what's happening in the index so that when misinformation, you know, if someone wants to discredit this effort, how easy or hard would it be so that we can put guardrails up to say, no, that's not true. And it's something we all should look at because we, SPI, not me, goes back to 50, were there 8 public data sources there? All someone has to do is say, well, that's a great index, but you know, one of those major sources sucks. They're biased, they're not right. And misinformation starts to occur. Can we put some guardrails up now or get in place for that so when SPI wants to be discredited because it shows that things are really working or not working, can we do that in some way?
And let's get Karen in before, because we've got about 2.5 minutes, so that's a good question about SPI and risks there.
Great, thank you, and thank you for the discussion. I'd be really interested in the panel's advice to us as individuals. How should we be consuming information?
Anyone?
So
Let's keep it.
maybe just really quick, I think I'll leave it to the researchers and folks who've looked at this more broadly, but you know, one of the campaigns that we're trying to get out there is just to have people stop before they forward anything on. You know, really think about, where did this come from? What's the sort of message that what's it trying to do? Is it making me angry? And that, you know, I'm so upset about this thing, I'm gonna send it to everybody I know. So just to sort of stop, breathe, maybe not forward something on, read the piece before you actually, you know, send it along. And then I think, you know, so the topic of this is truth and trust. And throughout yesterday and the day before, you know, it really resonated with me, this sort of the human interaction and the kind of relationships that we need to build, and just the need to reconnect with one another. And you know, we spend so much of our time, our lives online. And when I had these face-to-face conversations with my family members over the holidays, you know, even if we walked away and they didn't really shift completely their way of thinking, it was so significant for us to just reconnect, so that next time around, if I say, well, actually, you know, you might want to think about that a little bit more, I think they might do that. Right? I think we just need to reconnect with one another. I know COVID has made it really difficult. Everybody is even spending more time online now. But I do think just getting to truth and trust and reconnecting, looking people in the eye, breathing, that great deep listening exercise that we did yesterday, you know, and just try to look at one another as human beings and who we fundamentally are. Because, you know, what motivates us to believe the fake news and the angry messages that we get is because maybe we're just feeling disconnected, and that's, you know, a way to sort of shift from that. So anyway, let's reconnect.
I'm so glad you ended on that. We are at time, because I was actually going to evoke the kind of the deep listening and the degree to which, no, I mean, if you deeply listen to many people with whom you fundamentally disagree, I mean, I could deeply listen to the Taliban government about the views of women in society and walk away not feeling any more like I see your point of view. But it is also true that, like, quoting facts to people's emotions is a surefire way of going nowhere, whereas listening to what the underlying feeling is behind the facts that are being used is at least the beginning of something where one can find a degree of connection and consensus. And I'm really glad you evoked that at the end as a way of how does one kind of build that trust and build that truth in the face of radically different frameworks. So thank you, Justin, thank you, Kourosh, thank you, Mintu, and thank you all of you for listening.